Before I go into this good news that I see coming, I'd like to address some questions that I'm sure a lot of you have. It's how did we get here? How did this happen? And how did it happen so secretly? And what are economic hitmen anyway? And where do they come from? And of course, all of these things are addressed in lots of detail in the book, so I ought to stop talking now and let you buy the book. But I'll go into it a little bit. As Barbara mentioned, I was recruited by the National Security Agency, the NSA, into becoming an economic hitman, and by an amazing woman named Claudine, who's described in detail in the book, trained me and brought me into the system. And then I worked for a private corporation, which is the way it's done now. Can everybody hear me, incidentally? Yes, good. Which is the way it's done now. It's so that there won't be any blame assigned to the U.S. government. The way economic hitmen work in general, we do many different things, but perhaps if there's one that's most typical, it's that we identify a third world country that has resources that we covet, like oil. And then we arrange a huge loan from an organization like the World Bank or one of its sisters here in town for that third world country. Most of the money for that loan, in most cases, does not go to that country. It goes directly to a U.S. corporation, ones we hear about a lot these days, like Bechtel and Halliburton. That company then builds a large infrastructure project in the country, hydroelectric plants, energy grids, ports, industrial parks, things that serve the very rich and usually don't help the poor at all. But these are things that leave the country holding a huge debt, so huge, in fact, that it can't possibly repay it, and that's by intent. That's what I did for a living. So that at some point we economic hitmen can go back to this country and say, look, you owe us a lot of money, you can't repay your debts, so do us a favor, a pound of flesh, sell your oil real cheaply to our oil companies, or vote with us on the next critical UN vote, or send troops in support of ours someplace in the world, like Iraq. And I'll give you a couple of examples of the way this works, and then we'll move on to the good news, just so you understand. But for example, in Panama, and I talk about this in detail in the book, but in Panama, I was sent down to bring Omar Torrijos around. Torrijos was the first president of Panama that was really popular among the people following about 50 years, the whole history of Panama, of puppet dictatorships. And I was sent down to bring him around, and he invited me to a little bungalow outside Panama City. He said, look, I know the game you're playing, and I know that if I play the game with you, I'll become fabulously rich. But that's not my interest. I want to help my poor people. I'm not making Omar out to be an angel. He wasn't an angel, but he did want to help his poor people. So he said, you can either get the hell out of my country or play the game my way. Well, I went back to my bosses in Boston, and we agreed that I should stay there. After all, as long as I was there, I might bring him around. We could make a little money in the process. And so I stayed there. But Omar was in a very special position because he was renegotiating or trying to renegotiate the Panama Canal Treaty with the United States to turn the canal over to his people. And so the whole world was watching this man. Everybody everywhere, especially in the third world, was watching this man. And I knew that if Omar didn't come around, if I failed as an economic hitman, then the jackals would step in. And the jackals are what we called CIA-sanctioned operatives that try to overthrow governments or assassinate the leaders. There's a long history of this, as most of you know. We economic hitmen don't fail very often, but when we do, we know the jackals are there in the shadows. And sure enough, I failed, and Omar was assassinated. His plane was blown up in the air. That's one example. A second example is Saudi Arabia. As a few of you I see from looking at your faces, there are a few of you here who remember the early 70s, as I do, when OPEC decided to shut off oil to us. They didn't like our policies in Israel. So they cut down our oil supplies, and we had long lines of cars waiting at the gas stations. Remember that? Yeah. And we were afraid that we were going to have another depression like in the 30s. And so the U.S. Treasury Department came to me and a few other economic hitmen and said, look, you got to devise a plan so that this can never happen again. We can't be blackmailed by a bunch of Middle Eastern sheikdoms. And we knew that the key to any such plan had to rest with Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia controlled more oil than anybody else, and the House of Saud, the royal family, was corruptible. And so to make a long story short, the long version's in the book, but the short version is we reached a plan whereby Saudi Arabia would reinvest almost all the money it made from selling oil to the world, would invest that in U.S. government securities. The interest from those government securities would go to the U.S. Treasury Department. The Treasury Department would hire U.S. corporations to rebuild Saudi Arabia. Petrochemical plants, desalination plants, power grids, highways, in fact, complete cities out of the desert that would be westernized. And in fact, that worked very well. Part of the plan also was that Saudi Arabia would guarantee to keep the price of oil within limits acceptable to us, and we would guarantee the continued rule of the House of Saud. Plan worked very, very well in Saudi Arabia, we thought. Of course, we know now there's what the CIA calls blowback, made Osama bin Laden very angry, made a lot of Arabs and Muslims around the world very angry to have their most sacred sites surrounded by petrochemical plants and McDonald's. So there has been blowback. But at the time, it seemed like a great success. We thought we would implement the same policy in Iraq. Now, Saddam Hussein had been put into power by us. As a lot of you probably know, there was a very popular president of Iraq named Qassam, who decided that the Iraqis should benefit more from the oil produced by their countries, and so he threatened to either tax or nationalize foreign oil companies. We decided we needed to get rid of him. We hired a young high school student and his team to assassinate Qassam. The high school student failed, was slightly wounded. His name was Saddam Hussein. So the CIA went directly and captured Qassam and had him executed publicly on Iraqi television, put Saddam Hussein's family, his cousin, in charge. Saddam was a vice president in charge of security who eventually rose to president. During the 80s, we economic hitmen went in and we sold him or gave him or loaned him a lot of jets, a lot of tanks. We built chemical plants for him that we knew full well were being used to produce chemical weapons that were used against the Iranians and the Kurds. We knew this. We also then tried to get Saddam to buy the same deal that the Saudis had bought, but he wouldn't buy. If he had bought, he'd still be head of that country and we'd be building him chemical plants. But he didn't. So we sent in the Jackals. The Jackals failed with Saddam. He had too good a security forces, too many double lookalikes. They couldn't get through to him. So he sent in the military in '91. Now, the military could have taken Saddam out at the time, but didn't want to. We didn't want to get rid of Saddam. He's the kind of guy we like, we economic hitmen. He's a strong man. He was a good buffer against Iran. And if we thought he'd been sufficiently chastised by us destroying his military, then in the 90s he would come around. Economic hitmen went back in. He didn't come around. Jackals went back in. They couldn't take him out. So we sent the military in once again. Why I tell these two stories, three really, Panama, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq, is that Panama demonstrates the first step when economic hitmen fail, the Jackals go in. Saudi Arabia demonstrates what happens when the economic hitmen succeed, which is the most common. And Iraq demonstrates what happens when both the economic hitmen and the Jackals fail, then the military goes in. Then and only then. And I would just like to point out that today, this very moment, this is going on in Latin America. As many of you know, 80% of South America's population, over 80%, representing 7 countries, in their most recent elections voted in the president who ran on a very strong anti-US, anti-World Bank, anti-IMF policy. Latin America sent us a very strong message. The most recent is Evo Morales of Bolivia. And as soon as those men become elected president, Evo Morales right now has an economic hitman, or did yesterday or will tomorrow or both days, walks into his office and says, "Congratulations, Mr. President. I just want you to know that in this briefcase over here, I've got a couple of $100 million for you and your family if you play our game. In this briefcase over here, I've got a gun with a bullet with your name on it if you decide to keep your campaign promises." He whispers into his ear, "Remember, what happened to Jaime Roldos of Ecuador and Salvador Allende of Chile. Remember what happened to Arbenz of Guatemala and Torrijos of Panama and Noriega. And remember what happened to Qassam of Iraq and Mossadegh of Iran, and on and on and on.